The final verdict. Chapter 1. The crime scene. Assistant District Attorney David Carson stood at the edge of the crime scene, his eyes scanning the small, cluttered apartment. The dim glow of the streetlights outside barely penetrated the heavy curtains, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the room. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, mingling with the faint scent of stale takeout food. It was a scene of chaos. Furniture overturned, papers scattered, and in the center of it all, the lifeless body of Maria Gomez. She had been shot twice in the chest, the blood pooling around her in a grotesque halo. Her eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling as if in shock. Carson knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb any evidence. This was the third murder in as many weeks, and the city was on edge. The press was already calling it the work of a serial killer, and the public was demanding justice. But there was something off about this case, something that didn't sit right with Carson. "Dave," a voice called from behind him. Carson turned to see Detective Laura Bennett, her face pale and drawn. She had been working the case for weeks, and the strain was beginning to show. "We found the gun. It was stashed in the closet. Serial numbers are filed off, but it's the same caliber as the bullets we pulled from the other two victims." Carson nodded, his mind racing. The evidence was mounting, but it was almost too convenient. The gun, the location, the timing, it all seemed too perfect. He glanced back at the body, a nagging thought tugging at the edges of his consciousness. "What do we know about the victim?" "Maria Gomez, age 32, Bennett replied, flipping through her notebook. "No priors, worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Neighbors said she was quiet, kept to herself. No known enemies." "No known enemies," Carson repeated, standing up and pacing the room. "Then why does she look like a target?" Bennett frowned, closing her notebook. "What are you thinking, Dave?" "I'm thinking someone wanted this to look like the work of a serial killer," Carson said, his voice low. "But this feels personal. Whoever did this knew her." Bennett's eyes widened. "Are you saying this isn't connected to the other murders?" "I'm saying it might be a copycat," Carson replied, glancing around the room once more. "And if that's the case, then the real killer is still out there and we're running out of time." He turned to leave, his mind already racing with the implications. If they were dealing with a copycat, they had to act fast before the trail went cold. But as he reached the door, something caught his eye, a small, folded piece of paper tucked under the corner of the coffee table. He bent down to pick it up, his pulse quickening as he unfolded the note. In neat, precise handwriting it read, "This is only the beginning. The truth is buried deeper than you think." Carson's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a murder, it was a message, and whoever was behind it was playing a dangerous game. Chapter 2. The suspect. The following morning, Carson sat in his office, staring at the note. He had read it over a dozen times, trying to decipher its meaning, but it remained an enigma. The words taunted him, echoing in his mind as he sifted through the files on Maria Gomez. He knew he was missing something, some crucial piece of information that would unravel the mystery, but it remained frustratingly out of reach. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his concentration. He picked it up, noting the caller ID. It was Detective Bennett. "We've got a suspect," she said without preamble. "One of Maria's neighbors saw a man leaving her apartment the night she was killed. We brought him in for questioning." Carson's heart skipped a beat. "Who is he?" "His name is Carlos Mendoza," Bennett replied. "He's got a record, petty theft, assault. Nothing major, but he's been in and out of trouble for years. Says he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but he's nervous. Something doesn't add up." Carson grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. When he arrived at the precinct, Bennett was waiting for him outside the interrogation room. Through the one-way glass, Carson could see a man in his early 30s, his hands fidgeting on the table in front of him. He looked scared, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "What do we know about him?" Carson asked, still focused on the man inside. "Not much," Bennett admitted. "He's been living in the building for about 6 months. According to the landlord, he's always paid his rent on time, never caused any trouble. But the neighbor who spotted him says he was acting suspiciously that night, kept glancing over his shoulder, like he didn't want to be seen." Carson frowned. "Does he have an alibi?" "He claims he was at a bar across town when the murder happened, but the bartender doesn't remember seeing him," Bennett said. "He's got no solid alibi, and his prints were found on the gun we recovered from the scene. Carson sighed, running a hand through his hair. It all seemed too easy, too neat. The gun, the prints, the lack of an alibi. It was almost as if someone wanted Carlos Mendoza to take the fall. But if that was the case, who was really behind Maria Gomez's murder? And why go to such lengths to frame someone else? He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. "Let's see what he has to say," Carson said, pushing open the door to the interrogation room. Carlos looked up as they entered, his eyes wide with fear. "I didn't do it, man," he blurted out before they could even sit down. "I swear I didn't kill her." "Then why were your fingerprints on the gun?" Carson asked, his voice calm but firm. Carlos hesitated, his eyes darting between Carson and Bennett. I don't know, man. I've never even seen that gun before. I don't know how my prints got on it." Carson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're in a lot of trouble, Carlos. If you're innocent, you need to start talking. Tell us what really happened that night." Carlos swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "I was just trying to help her, okay? I heard a noise like a fight or something, and I went over to see if she was okay. The door was open, so I went in, and I found her there on the floor. I freaked out, man. I didn't know what to do. I checked to see if she was still alive, but she wasn't. Then I heard someone coming, so I panicked and ran." "And the gun?" Bennett asked, her voice sharp. Carlos shook his head vehemently. "I didn't touch no gun. I swear. I don't know how my prints got on it. I just wanted to help." Carson studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. There was something about Carlos's story that rang true, something that made Carson believe he might actually be telling the truth. But if Carlos didn't kill Maria Gomez, then who did? And more importantly, why were they trying so hard to make it look like he did? He stood up, his mind made up. "We're going to check out your story, Carlos. But if you're lying, you'll wish you had come clean now." Carlos nodded, his eyes wide with desperation. "I'm not lying, I swear. Please, you've got to believe me." As they left the room, Bennett turned to Carson, her expression unreadable. "Do you really think he's innocent?" Carson didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared through the glass at Carlos, his mind racing with possibilities. "I don't know," he finally said, "but I'm going to find out." Chapter 3. The Hidden Motive. David Carson sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of case files, his mind racing with the conflicting evidence. Carlos Mendoza's story had left him unsettled. The man was clearly terrified, but was it because he was guilty or because he had been set up? Carson knew they were running out of time. Carlos was the only suspect, and if they didn't find something to exonerate him, the case would go to trial, and a jury might convict him on the circumstantial evidence alone. But there was one thing Carson knew for certain: the note found at the crime scene. It wasn't something a common criminal would leave behind. It was a taunt, a challenge, and it implied that there was more to this murder than anyone realized. Carson leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling as he pieced together the fragments of the puzzle. Maria Gomez had been a nurse, a profession that didn't typically lead to enemies or violence. Yet, someone had gone to great lengths to make her murder look like the work of a serial killer. What was so special about Maria Gomez that someone wanted her dead and was willing to frame an innocent man for it? A soft knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was Bennett, holding a thin folder. "We've been digging into Maria's background," she said, closing the door behind her. "There's something you need to see." Carson took the folder, flipping it open. Inside were documents detailing Maria's financial records, her employment history, and, Carson's eyes narrowed, her recent bank statements. 2 large deposits were made into her account a week before she was killed, Bennett explained. One for $10,000, the other for $15,000. Both from anonymous sources. Carson frowned. Why would a nurse suddenly come into that kind of money? "We're not sure yet," Bennett replied. "But there's more. Maria made a call to a law firm the day before she was murdered. She spoke to a lawyer named Richard Langley." "Richard Langley?" Carson repeated, recognizing the name. Langley was a high-profile defense attorney, known for representing some of the city's most notorious criminals. Why would she be in contact with him? "That's what we need to find out," Bennett said. "Langley's not talking, but I have a feeling he knows more than he's letting on." Carson's mind was racing. This new information changed everything. Maria wasn't just a random victim, she was involved in something that had led to her death. And the money, the lawyer, it all pointed to something much bigger than a simple murder. "We need to talk to Langley," Carson said, closing the folder. If Maria was involved in something illegal, it might explain why someone wanted her dead. Bennett nodded, but her expression was troubled. "Do you think this could be connected to the other murders?" Carson hesitated. It was a possibility he hadn't considered. The other victims had been killed in a similar fashion, and there were no obvious connections between them. But if Maria was involved in something criminal, it could mean the other victims were as well. "It's possible," Carson admitted, "but we won't know for sure until we talk to Langley. He's the key to all of this." As they left the office, Carson couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something much darker than they had anticipated. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of lies and deceit, and it was only a matter of time before it came to light. Chapter 4. The Lawyer's Secret. Richard Langley's office was a far cry from the small, cluttered space Carson worked in. It was all polished wood and glass, with expensive artwork adorning the walls and a view of the city skyline that most people could only dream of. Carson had always found it ironic that a man who made his living defending criminals could afford such luxury, but he wasn't here to admire the decor. Langley himself was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, his expression cool and confident as he gestured for Carson and Bennett to sit. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Mr. Carson?" Carson didn't waste any time. "We're here about Maria Gomez." Langley's smile faltered ever so slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Ah yes, tragic what happened to her. But I'm afraid I don't know much about the case." "You spoke to her the day before she was killed," Carson said, watching Langley closely for any reaction. "What did she want?" Langley's eyes narrowed and he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "I'm afraid that information is privileged, Mr. Carson. Attorney-client confidentiality, you understand." "This isn't a game, Langley," Bennett snapped. "We know about the money, and we know Maria was involved in something she shouldn't have been. If you're protecting someone, now's the time to start talking." Langley's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Detective. I don't have any information that could help you." Carson leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "If you're covering for someone, you're just as guilty as they are. We can get a warrant, subpoena your records. It's only a matter of time before we find out what you're hiding." For a moment, Langley said nothing, his gaze locked with Carson's. Then, with a sigh, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a file, sliding it across the desk. "Maria came to me because she was scared," Langley said, his tone suddenly serious. "She had gotten herself involved with some very dangerous people. She didn't give me many details, but it was clear that she was in way over her head. She was looking for protection, but it was too late." Carson opened the file, his eyes scanning the documents inside. It was a contract between Maria and a shadowy figure known only as Mr. X. The terms were vague, but the implications were clear. Maria had been working for someone doing something illegal, and it had cost her her life. "Who is Mr. X?" Carson demanded, but Langley shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maria never told me and I didn't press. All I know is that she was supposed to deliver something valuable. But she got cold feet and backed out at the last minute. That's when the threats started. And now she's dead," Bennett said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. Langley nodded. "I'm sorry I couldn't be more help, but that's all I know. Whoever this Mr. X is, he's powerful and dangerous. If he wanted Maria dead, it's because she knew something that could ruin him." Carson closed the file, his mind racing. This was the break they needed, the connection that tied Maria's murder to something much bigger. But it also meant that they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had realized. As they left Langley's office, Carson felt a chill run down his spine. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together, but the picture they were forming was more terrifying than he could have imagined. "Do you really think this Mr. X had her killed?" Bennett asked as they walked down the hallway. Carson nodded grimly. "I do. And if we don't find him soon, more people are going to die." Chapter 5. The chase begins. The sun had set by the time Carson and Bennett returned to the precinct, but neither of them felt the least bit tired. The revelations from their meeting with Langley had left them both on edge, a sense of urgency hanging over them like a storm cloud. They had stumbled onto something big, something that could shake the city to its core, but they were still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. Carson sat at his desk, staring at the file Langley had given him. The name Mr. X was scrawled in bold letters at the top of the contract, taunting him with its anonymity. Who was this man? What kind of power did he wield that allowed him to operate in the shadows, pulling strings that led to Maria Gomez's death? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Bennett's voice. We ran the contract through our databases, but it's a dead end. No records, no matches. Whoever this Mr. X is, he's a ghost. Carson nodded, not surprised. That's how he wants it. But ghosts leave traces, and if Maria knew something that got her killed, there's a trail somewhere. We just have to find it. Bennett leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed. So where do we start? We've got a suspect in custody who might be innocent, a dead nurse with ties to a criminal mastermind and no solid leads. Carson's mind was already working on a plan. Maria was supposed to deliver something. Whatever it was valuable enough to get her killed. We need to find out what it was and who else might have been involved. What about the money? Bennett asked. Those deposits weren't random. Someone paid her, and it wasn't Mr. X. He wouldn't need to, he was already in control. Carson nodded. Exactly. Which means there's another player in this game, someone who wanted Maria to do something and was willing to pay for it. We need to trace those deposits. I'll get on it, Bennett said, already heading for the door. But she paused, turning back to Carson. You think this is bigger than just Maria, don't you? Carson didn't hesitate. I think this goes deep, deeper than we've realized. And if we don't stop it, more people are going to die. As Bennett left, Carson picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Carson, what do you need? It was Jake, an old contact of Carson's who had his ear to the ground in the city's underworld. If there was something going on, Jake would know about it, or at least know who to ask. I need information, Carson said, keeping his voice low. I'm looking for someone who goes by the name Mr. X. Ever heard of him? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Carson could almost hear the wheels turning in Jake's head. Mr. X, huh? That's a name I've heard whispered a few times. Dangerous guy if the rumors are true. No one knows who he is, but he's connected, real connected. Why are you asking? Because he's involved in a murder I'm investigating, Carson replied. I need to find him, Jake. Can you help me? Jake sighed. I can try, but you're asking for a lot, Carson. This guy isn't just some thug. He's the kind of person who makes people disappear without a trace. You sure you want to go down this road? I don't have a choice, Carson said, the determination in his voice clear. If we don't find him, more people are going to die. All right, Jake said after a moment. I'll see what I can dig up. But be careful, Carson. You're playing with fire. Carson hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He knew Jake was right. This was dangerous territory. But he also knew that if he backed down now, he would be letting a killer go free. And that was something he couldn't live with. As the hours ticked by, Carson worked tirelessly, piecing together what little information they had. He knew they were running out of time, but he also knew that they were getting closer. Every lead, every clue, was bringing them one step nearer to the truth. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jake. Got something. Meet me at the docks, Pier 14. Come alone. Carson's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the break they had been waiting for. He grabbed his coat and headed out, his mind racing with possibilities. If Jake had found something, it could be the key to bringing down Mr. X and finally getting justice for Maria. But as he drove through the deserted streets toward the docks, a nagging feeling of dread settled in the pit of his stomach. He knew this was a dangerous game and the stakes were higher than ever. But he had come too far to turn back now. As he approached Pier 14, the fog rolled in thick and heavy, obscuring the view. Carson parked his car and stepped out, scanning the area for any sign of Jake. The docks were eerily quiet, the only sound the distant lapping of water against the pier. Carson moved cautiously, his eyes darting to every shadow. The sense of danger was palpable, and he could feel the tension in the air. As he rounded a corner, he spotted a figure standing near the edge of the pier, partially obscured by the fog. It was Jake. Carson approached, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun holstered at his side. Jake. The figure turned and Carson's blood ran cold. It wasn't Jake. Before he could react, the man pulled a gun, and a single shot echoed through the night. Carson's world went black. Chapter 6. The final countdown. Carson awoke to the sensation of cold steel against his wrists. He was in a dark, damp room, the faint smell of salt water lingering in the air. His head throbbed from where he had been struck, and it took a moment for him to gather his bearings. He was tied to a chair, the ropes cutting into his skin, and his gun was gone. A door creaked open and a figure stepped into the room. The light from the hallway cast long shadows, and Carson squinted to make out the man's features. It was the same man from the docks, the one who had shot him. The man smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. "Welcome back, Mr. Carson. You've been causing quite a bit of trouble." Carson glared at him, refusing to show fear. "Who are you? Where's Jake?" The man chuckled, crossing the room to stand in front of Carson. "Jake won't be joining us. You see, he made a mistake. He crossed someone he shouldn't have. Just like you." "Mr. X," Carson spat, realizing the truth. "You're Mr. X." The man's smile widened. "In the flesh. But I have to say I'm disappointed. I thought you'd be smarter than this, Carson. Getting involved in something that's way over your head." Carson's mind raced, searching for a way out. "You killed Maria Gomez, and now you're going to kill me. But why? What are you hiding?" Mr. X's expression darkened. "Maria made a mistake. She got greedy, thought she could play both sides. But there are consequences for betraying me." "And what about the other victims?" Carson pressed, trying to buy time. "Were they part of this too?" Mr. X's eyes gleamed with a sinister light. "Some were, some weren't. It doesn't really matter, does it? The point is, they all ended up the same way." Carson knew he was running out of time. He had to find a way to get free, to stop this man before more lives were lost. But the ropes were too tight and the room was empty, save for the chair he was tied to. Mr. X leaned in close, his voice a cold whisper. "You've been a thorn in my side, Carson. But all of that ends tonight." He stood up and walked toward the door, pausing to glance back at Carson. "Goodbye, Mr. Carson." As the door closed behind him, Carson knew he had only minutes, maybe seconds, before Mr. X's men returned to finish the job. He twisted his wrists, ignoring the pain as he struggled against the ropes. He couldn't die here, not like this. Not without stopping Mr. X. Then, as he was about to lose hope, he heard a faint sound, footsteps approaching the door. But these weren't the heavy steps of a killer. They were lighter, quicker. The door burst open and Bennett rushed in, gun drawn. "Carson." Relief flooded through him as she quickly untied the ropes. "How did you find me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I traced your phone," she said, pulling him to his feet. "When you didn't come back, I knew something was wrong." Carson could hardly believe it. They had been moments away from losing everything, but Bennett had come through. "There's no time," he said urgently. "Mr. X is here. We have to stop him." They moved quickly through the building, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Carson's heart pounded in his chest, every nerve on edge as they searched for Mr. X. They couldn't let him escape, not after everything he had done. Finally, they reached the main room where Mr. X was waiting. He stood calmly in the center, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Going somewhere?" Bennett asked, her gun trained on him. Mr. X's smile was cold. "You think you've won, don't you? But this is far from over. You'll never stop me." Carson stepped forward, his voice steady. "It's over, Mr. X. You're done." But Mr. X only laughed. "You're naive, Carson. There are others like me, more powerful, more dangerous. You've only scratched the surface." Before Carson could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air, and within moments, the room was flooded with officers. Mr. X was taken into custody, his expression never wavering from that same cold smile. As Carson and Bennett watched him being led away, a sense of victory washed over them. They had done it, they had stopped a monster. But as they looked at each other, they knew that this wasn't the end. Mr. X's words echoed in their minds, a chilling reminder that the fight was far from over. They had won this battle, but the war had only just begun.